Welcome to Longevity Industries, presentation of the Destiny of Manufacturing podcast. I'm your host, Dean Phillips, and today with me I have the founder from Rethinkery, Devin Fidler. Welcome, Devin.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
It's great to have you here. So right off the bat, tell me, what are some of the big things that you see changing on the landscape over the next 5 years?
Sure. One that we've been particularly interested in is what we've been calling organizational technologies. So I think when we think of technology, we tend to think of, kind of the material side, the physical side of it. But there's a lot going on around just how you organize people to get things done. And as that moves forward, it seems to open up the opportunity to create, companies, organizations, even kind of governance structures that really don't look like things we've seen before.
Now, can you expand on that a little bit? Are you thinking more of an open source kind of philosophy where it's a lot more of sharing internally and externally?
Yeah, there's certainly some of that. Some of the specific kind of examples we've been looking at include what's going on in crowdsourcing, for example. If you followed crowdsourcing, say, a decade ago, a lot of it was really at the level of Amazon's Mechanical Turk program, let's say, where kind of little tasks would be created, and then anybody in the world could pick those up and do those and get a little bit of a reward. It's gotten a lot more complex, though. It's gotten to the point now where information work is starting to resemble manufacturing assembly lines in a lot of ways. Right? It's possible to sequence a series of information processes to get something kind of really useful at the end. One example is research. The way we do it at Rethinkery, we start with a general crowdsourcing process. We have kind of hundreds of people sort of give first thought input into into their view on a particular topic. But then we'll start to have experts really drill down, right? Like a funnel. You start to pull in, say, professional journalists, people who are really deeply experienced in a field that emerges from that crowdsourcing as one of kind of particular interest. So that you can chain together, like a bunch of Legos, a series of information processes that sort of refine and enhance the output at each stage until at the end you have something that kind of is generated by a total of a couple hundred people, but really is more useful than anything kind of a traditional research group of 5-6 people could put together. That sort of assembly line approach to kind of what we've traditionally thought of as knowledge work, I think, is a really key piece of it.
That's really interesting. I've been participating with the I-Core group within the Small Business Administration, and one of the things that they do is they feel it's very beneficial to have customer discovery, which is very similar, where you're reaching out to all of the stakeholders and talking to them about what's important to them. And I think if you've gone through those kinds of processes, it really refines your questions. It really kind of outlines in a more particular way of what it is that people want and need, more so than just the assumptions I think you make on the front end. Would you say that that's very similar?
I would, yeah. I would say anytime you have, kind of a modular process like that it's really, kind of a hint that this is going on. In a lot of ways, organizations as a whole are starting to resemble technology stacks, right? You have people outsourcing whole functions, basically through the, kind of through the IT department. So, something as complex as, the HR might be handled by a company like TriNet, or, there are a bunch of people doing it in finance and, sort of the accounting side. But that's really new, right? Like, we've traditionally thought of organizations as something you kind of found and you kind of build the whole team, and you really run it as an integrated whole, but it isn't something that you've assembled from external Legos traditionally, right? Like a generation and a half ago. The fact that you can now, kind of choose from a series of vendors who you can, kind of select a whole business department from. that's a new, kind of a new thing. That's new territory we're in.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And if you look around at companies like Upwork and things like that, which basically are founded on, look, we've got people that are supplying one thing and other people that need one thing, and you can actually progress through. There's plenty of businesses that are founded on not having to have the internal expertise, but looking outwards to find more people to get involved in a project like that. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to be involved with and founding, of course, Rethinkery.
Yeah. So I started, kind of a million miles away from what I'm doing now. And I started out at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington in their research and analysis center. So kind of the research arm that is in some ways disconnected from the rest of what they do. My portfolio included manufacturing and media. So I was looking at kind of what was going on in the manufacturing and media spaces. This was sort of at the peak of outsourcing. And in both cases, there was this, kind of this sense that these were huge industries going through a huge transformation, and some of the sort of traditional players were making it, and some of them weren't, right? And so I became really interested in the difference between, players who are able to jump to completely new models and those that, kind of just don't quite manage to do that. And it carried it through. So it's really the through line to today, that we're really looking for those moments of kind of, we sometimes talk about them as like nonlinear change, or, kind of big disruptions that happen very, kind of very quickly, and how exactly you can tackle those, right? How can you leverage what you have inside your organization to adapt to, kind of maybe a new environment that appears more quickly than you'd anticipated.
Right. And I think that's, especially today, when you look at things like smart and you think about utilizing AI, utilizing voice commands, utilizing all aspects of AR, VR, leveraging additive manufacturing and things like that. All these types of systems that are out there really can be integrated in more ways, I think, than people realize, to reach a greater outcome. Because if you only look at the narrow aspect of this is what we do, without looking outside and saying, what is it that people want from us? I think that people have to reevaluate that. How do you think companies and businesses and organizations as a whole, how they can go about changing that thought process?
The big one I always recommend as a starting point is just playing around with the tools. You mentioned Upwork, which is a great sort of starting sandbox. I've worked with a lot of organizations where the first, kind of the first step is really to go find on-demand freelancing platforms like Upwork, like Freelancer, like TopSal. There's a whole bunch. And start to figure out what you can do and really how much you can get done with very limited resources, right? It's possible in many cases to tap into the expertise of, kind of world-class people you wouldn't necessarily expect to, kind of to be able to tap for, kind of a week, 2 weeks. Pull in their expertise, integrate it into whatever project you're doing, and then, kind of move to the next person. It's a different way of thinking about management. A lot of the sort of traditional people management formulas that I think people have adapted to throughout their careers at big companies in particular don't necessarily work all that well. But when you get the rhythm of it, when you figure out how to orchestrate these, kind of these on-demand resources more effectively, it really is amazing what you can get done with them.
I think a lot of times people get bogged down by thinking, well, we don't have the expertise in-house. We do not have the technology, but companies like Xometry and people like that who have developed a on-demand process where maybe you don't have the capacity, maybe you don't have the expertise, but you can outsource that and pay a per part fee for that to accomplish your goals. I think that in many cases, that opportunity is shifting outside. I think you put it perfectly, which is that we are thinking more like a computer program in many ways. If this, then that. And what are we trying to tie together? Too often we get bogged down by looking at outcomes that may never come to fruition. But if you, that kind of fail quick, fail fast kind of mentality of, well, let's go out and try. Let's see what's possible. Let's talk to people and see where that takes us. And maybe that takes us in a completely different direction than where we start with our process. Are there companies that you've worked with or businesses and organizations that have found new ways to utilize their personnel even to move them in different ways and even seek out other technology experts to help them grow their business in multiple folds?
Yeah, one that comes to mind in this context is a food manufacturing company that really looked at its whole, its whole supply chain through this lens, through this kind of modular sort of network-based lens, and found all kinds of interesting ways to integrate, for example, IoT or expertise on demand to really rethink what their org chart looks like, right? What had been before the process a very traditional org chart suddenly became something that looked maybe more like the Uber app, right? Like the ability to sort of call on the human resources and the physical resources that turn out to be needed in a kind of a very dynamic way to respond to change, to get things to get things done. It's an interesting new approach, right? It's sort of a swarm-based approach in a lot of ways, as opposed to a kind of an org chart-based approach. And there are I think still growing pains and hiccups. I don't want to suggest that it's kind of the case that all companies can switch over to this, but the new capabilities, particularly for smaller, more entrepreneurial organizations, around acting as an orchestra conductor rather than sort of as the mason building things up, kind of brick by brick from the ground. You really can get a jump on things very quickly. You can you can be an individual today and sort of a globally exporting company in some in some sense a week from now, and that's a really interesting space to explore.
Along those same lines, what challenges have you seen for compiling? It's one thing, and I've said this time and again, is that one challenge that people have had is big data is one thing, compiling it into a usable format is another. Have you found challenges with that, where you're trying to kind of massage towards a holistic approach, but you're getting all these pieces of the puzzle, and you kind of have to use more of an AI approach where, or taxonomy approach where, what are some of the key words that I'm using to get me to, yes, 90% of the people agree that this is what we're trying to work towards. But when you have that in just a verbal form or a word form, how do you work towards finding a solution when you have so much input, so much information, so much IoT as a way to put it?
That's a great point. I think you're absolutely right that when you look at sort of data utilization and integrating data into these processes. I think the dirty secret of data science is mostly data cleaning, right? But getting that data in a position where you're able to, you're able to really use it cleanly and effectively is it's a lot of work. There are kind of tools emerging for that. That's sort of the frontier where we are. There are, this sort of dynamic approach to that is emerging, but I don't think it's, it's fully there yet. As far as just integrating these stackable components in general and making sure everyone's aligned, one unintuitive strategy that I think works more often than you might suspect is experimentation, right? One nice thing about switching from big fixed costs to, kind of very dynamic variable costs is that you can try a bunch of solutions in parallel and then really open up the channels that work pretty well, right? So you can have, if you have a hunch that one of 5 ways, let's say, will work to complete a particular project, in this sort of more dynamic model, the fixed costs to do that are relatively minimal. And so you can just set up all 5 of those approaches. You'll sort of discover 2 of them, they didn't work out at all. They'll kind of go off the rails. Maybe one will, kind of perform okay, but it'll be sort of mediocre. One will exceed expectations, and one will see sort of a breakthrough, right? It'll be kind of a really interesting, you'll be more effective than you'd anticipated. In a traditional organization, that search process is very, very expensive, right? Like in the most extreme cases, you have to retool like one facility for all of those, right? By approaching it, kind of in this network-based way, in this, kind of parallelized way, that search process can really be, can be, kind of made much shorter and much, kind of much more effective. And when you find those recipes that work, right, for all machine learning and AI in industry, it's really a game of trying to find the recipe that, kind of produces something useful at the other end. When you do that, that can be profoundly valuable.
Yeah, I agree. It's if I look at how some companies operate, and if you think in terms of what are you're talking about fixed costs and things like that, when let's say I'm running a manufacturing facility, well, I've got to buy this equipment. I'm going to have to tool up. There's an investment within that. On the same side of that same approach, when you talk about human capital, what kinds of approaches can you use from kind of lessons learned that we learn from manufacturing and technology to apply that to the human capital so that we're not making that huge commitment until we know that it's going to yield results? How do you approach that?
You've already mentioned kind of Upwork and the ability to access freelance talent. Very often people who are just doing things on the side, but they let you try out specific orientation or sort of approach. You can find people who have the background that sort of what you're looking for, and just give it a try, right? It's not a huge investment. There is this stringing together of human expertise, and the fact that I think traditionally the information friction, right? Kind of just the process of communicating it has made it pretty difficult to break down projects that aren't going to be super repetitive information work projects. So you tend to assign kind of the whole thing to one person and say, let me see what you can come up with. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to rather than doing that, try to break down the problem, right? Try to break it down into component parts and assign those to people who are kind of particularly gifted or talented in those areas. So if you're, let's say you're in real estate, right? You're in the real estate space and you're trying to do, let's say something really simple like house flipping. You can imagine now, unlike even a decade ago, you can imagine a software program that systematically uses machine learning to figure out what properties are most likely to be undervalued, right? Like that's something that machine learning could do today. You can figure out then, using the same kind of data approach, well, what interventions tend to make those values go up as much as possible, right? And, maybe you quartz countertops or something, whatever, kind of whatever the list is of things. Identify for each property, these are the innovations that are most likely to spike that value for me. There isn't necessarily a platform yet where you can, kind of then source the workmen to do that in real time, but we're very, very close, right? If you look at where we are with work platforms, it's like we're 5 minutes away from that. It's so close. You can imagine, kind of that being part of the recipe, just finding, kind of the glaziers to put in the, kind of the energy efficient windows, or the, kind of the carpenters to rework the kitchen, whatever it is. And then autonomously putting it on the market again is also possible, right? So if you can break down big, kind of big sort of business value creation processes into little chunks, and then assign them to a combination of people and software in a way that looks very familiar to manufacturing, right? And something that looks an awful lot like an assembly line. Suddenly it becomes possible to, kind of to have manufacturing teach every other industry, kind of a lot of new tricks around how you can, kind of how you can organize that work to get, kind of the most useful output possible. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
no, I think it does. And it brings up another question that I would have because of that is, if I think in terms of a general contractor on building a house, well, one of the key elements that a general contractor has to be able to do is sequence things in the process, because it doesn't do me any good to have an electrician come in on day one when you haven't even poured a foundation. So there has to be an element of sequencing within this human capital aspect of information and working towards a solution for a problem. And that, even when you're outsourcing, when now you are the person who is the general contractor, you're the person who's handling kind of that element, and you may not be able to do the next thing or have the person come in and do that next phase of the project until the first phase is done. Do you find that to be a challenge within kind of these think tank environments?
Absolutely. So, we do develop software internally, and almost all of our software could be described as smart Gantt charts that sort of call people on these freelancing platforms for exactly that reason. That's, kind of that recipe building, that sequencing part, and making that as fluid as possible is sort of that's where the value creation is, right? Like that, the companies that can do that well are the ones that, kind of do well overall. And the companies that don't do that well tend to be the ones that, exactly as you described, they realize, we needed a glazier 3 months ago in order to be able to, to make sure that this thing is put together on time.
Right.
But yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
Yep. And I think too, with thinking of the environment right now with supply chain, one of the challenges is that exactly is some level of sequencing of something coming in. Humanistically, you do, of course, have tools like Gantt charts, which are exceptional. I mean, I was a huge fan when Microsoft Project came out to organize things, because too often you need to have a way to show people why it's important to hit a certain deadline. And I found it very helpful to be able to illustrate to people that, yes, you may think it's only a day, but here's what that means in the whole course of things and what that's going to impact our final deadline. And that means somebody else won't be able to do the full part of their job to the best of their ability, because you've now constrained their time. And in many ways, kind of similar to you would in Lean or Six Sigma philosophies, and theory of constraints of what is the bottleneck within these challenges. What would you say was your biggest aha moment when you first got involved in this to say that is what's impactful? That's what I learned the most, and that changed the whole way you were thinking.
I think the thing that maybe changed my thinking more than anything else, kind of as a small nugget, and it's been a long process, but there's a cybersecurity researcher named Bruce Schneier who sort of offhandedly at a conference had the quote, "Well, we're creating world-sized robots and we don't even realize it." He was talking about Internet of Things and what happens when you network together all of these, for example, manufacturing facilities, right? You can think of that in some ways as a world-sized robot if they're sufficiently integrated. And I just remember thinking as I, kind of after I heard that, like, that's true, but it's also true that we're kind of creating, company-sized robots, right? That when you network things together, that to your point about how this resembles programming, right? Like that person who's putting together that Gantt chart in this world we're heading into, like that's the program, right? Like that's the recipe, and you have all of these, kind of modular parts that can execute all of the components of that. But building that program is, is the key. So this sense, I guess, that as we build denser and denser networks, and we're able to, kind of activate, deactivate, and reconfigure resources to get them where they're needed, when they're needed, ever more dynamically. That the end game there looks an awful lot, at least on, on one dimension, like self-driving companies, right? Like the ability to have value creation chains to do as much as they possibly can for themselves, to, kind of create as much value as they can. We already have them on Wall Street, right? Like we already have investment tools that do this. And now as these networks are spilling out of our terminals on our desktops and connecting physical things, it's suddenly possible to orchestrate them in the same way, to, to activate, deactivate, and reconfigure resources in a, kind of dynamic way to get things done or produce value, kind of from beginning to end. I sometimes talk about ransomware, and, ransomware is awful stuff. It's, the scourge of any IT person. But if you look at how it works, it's really interesting in that, it is a program-driven approach to generating revenue. And if you took, say, the 10 people who run some of the most sophisticated ransomware, let's say the very most out there ransomware programs, the people who put it together, and they all drove off a cliff in a bus together, right? Like they all vanished. It would keep going. It would, they could keep generating revenue after they were all gone, right?
Right.
And this idea of a programmatic way to create value that can run even if it's left unattended for a while. It's something that people who have been doing, kind of work on lights out factories and, in the manufacturing space, there's a lot of analogies for this, but the idea that logic can be applied to a whole business model, like that was the eye opener to me, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's actually been a lot of what I've heard from people talking about what is one solution for the populating Mars philosophy is we make the assumption that it has to be people, and one of the assumptions was that if you just took how long could somebody live as just a brain working on a robot?
Mm-hmm.
And if you had a robot only, and a robot went there, and you could then repurpose that intelligence in a computer, and could a computer basically take itself, and could it find from raw materials and 3D print another robot and make another robot
mm-hmm.
and another robot, and that do all the front work in Mars of being able to do that, of creating this worker environment on Mars. And it's a very interesting thought of, kind of talking about how things can go on and on and on beyond if the program's written in a way that allows that. to continue. And I think there's a lot of those kinds of things that we have to examine and figure out where does this lead in the future? How does technology change? How do we, because this is, I'm at the age where I was in school when the first computers were out in the 80s, in the early 80s, and working on a Sinclair and the early Apples and things like that. But today is far greater technology-wise than that time, because it's everywhere and it permeates all aspects, and it's the cost. I think the availability, because you can buy a drone for, under a couple $100. You can get a 3D printer for a couple $100. The availability cost is not as inhibitive as it used to be. And you think about the technology that goes into that equipment, it's millions and millions and millions of dollars of technology that was in code that was written when they first figured out how to balance the loads of the motors and balance and understand what's going on with the aircraft when you got a drone, or be able to plan ahead for the temperature of a 3D printing head and those kinds of things. That technology that you have today in a $150 3D printer, the availability is, I think, one of the most important keys that we have today versus the 1980s and computers that came out.
That's such a good point. And the sort of spectrum of availability, right? Because you can get a 3D printer in your bedroom for a couple $100, or you can access, kind of a giant industrial 3D print bed for, kind of a couple of $100 if you integrate it into your technology stack. The fact that you can access a lot of this stuff without owning it.
Yes.
And for some processes, that's not appropriate, right? If you're gonna, if you're gonna run a standard process and it's just going to continue to loop, you don't necessarily want to rent. But if it is a batch job, or if it is something complex and detailed and, kind of customized, suddenly you have access to the greatest tools in the world, and you can, we're sort of a hair's breadth from having, say, kind of quantum computation available as a cloud service. It's a really interesting world.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Tell us where we can get in touch with you.
Yeah. So Rethinkery is the organization. I am just Devin at rethinkery.com.
Great. I really appreciate you taking the time with us today, Devin. Thank you for everything, and you have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Dean. Appreciate it.
Thank you.